Well, we come to this passage in Matthew, chapter 17, verses 14 to 23. And if you're among those that like to follow in your Bible, we'll also be referring quite a bit to the parallel passage that's in Mark chapter 9. It's in verses 14 to 29 in Mark's account. And it reminds me that I was once asked, why are there 4 gospel records? Why didn't God just so organise things that there was just one written by one person? Well, obviously I don't know the exact answer to that. I mean, nobody does. But it does teach us that we should we have to look through more than one book to get to grips with what God has revealed to us. So that's sort of training to use the whole Bible to find our way around and to understand what it is that God has revealed to us. That's just an aside, but I thought it reminded me that was the case. Now, as you know, sometimes I give my sermons titles and sometimes I don't. This one I've given it the title, Jesus, Lord of the Unseen Realms. And what we have here, the scene here is, of course, of Jesus. He's come down with his 3 disciples, Peter, John and James. The 4 of them have come down from what we call the Mount of Transfiguration. We call it that because we don't actually know where that mountain was. We know the likely vicinity, but we don't know which one it was. But we do know that Jesus was transfigured there before his 3 disciples, and we looked at that last week. Well, now, in fact, Luke tells us that it is the next day. And of course that makes sense, because as we saw, the transfiguration and those associated events around it happened during the night. Now, this account here in Matthew, on the face of it, is quite difficult to understand. But that's because Matthew gives us a summary. He summarised this event. Once we get the detail back that Mark has included, then the situation is much more clear. See, Matthew, he simply tells us that there's a multitude somewhere around the bottom of this mountain. Mark, however, he tells us, and when he came to his disciples, so this would be the rest of the disciples, he saw a great multitude about them and the scribes questioning with them. That's Mark 9, verse 14. And the scribes are a very important part of this narrative. Their presence also helps us understand what appears to be, on the face of it, if we only had the Matthew account, what appears to be a very sharp response that Jesus makes when he says, "O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you?" You see, that would be very harsh if it was directed at his disciples, or if it was directed at the father of this possessed young man. But once we know the scribes are there in the mix, it's not such an odd statement. We are getting ahead of ourselves there. But still with Mark, he tells us that before this unnamed man pleads for mercy for his son, Jesus asks the scribes what it is that they are questioning his disciples about. And then before they can answer him, this man, he blurts out, "Master, I have brought unto thee my son, which hath a dumb spirit." And both Matthew and Mark record the man saying that he had first brought his son to the disciples, but they could not cure him. So now, with all of this information at our disposal, it's not hard to work out what was going on with the scribes, what they were questioning at that time. Just remember that these scribes, they were no natural friends of Jesus. But this man, the father of the possessed son, he'd evidently heard of the fame of Jesus and his disciples, and on hearing that they were in the vicinity, he brought his son to them for healing. Now, he couldn't bring them to Jesus because Jesus was up the mountain with the other 3, but he brought them to the other disciples. The disciples, those 9, they had failed. Now, in the eyes of these scribes, that would be a victory for themselves. They could hold up this failure and suggest that Jesus was a fraud after all. There's no point listening to him. Look, he's impotent after all. Of course, they had to make use of this one failure, and one failure by the disciples, by the way, in the face of so many other miracles that had been performed in the sight of lots and lots of people. But that is what they were like. They had hardened hearts and blinded eyes. They simply refused to see. But they were evidently not making much of an impression on the people, because in Mark 9:15 we read, "And straightway all the people," so there was quite a gathering of them, "when they beheld him," this is Jesus, "when they beheld Jesus, they were greatly amazed, and running to him, saluted him." So they evidently didn't have much time for these scribes, because as soon as they catch sight of Jesus, they're off and they run after him. None less so, of course, than the father of this afflicted young man, and the father pleads for mercy, saying, "Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is lunatic and sore vexed, for oft times he falleth into the fire, and oft into the water." We wouldn't use the word lunatic much these days, but he was obviously distressed. But as I said just now, Matthew has summarised the event. We discover from Mark and Luke that the young man had suffered exceedingly. Now here it just says, "He falleth into the fire and oft into the water." That's all that Matthew tells us. And of course from that you might simply conclude that it was a simple matter of epilepsy. Let me tell you, of course, that epilepsy is no simple matter itself, but this additional information that the others give us leaves us in no doubt that this is actually not an illness as such, but demon possession at work. And Jesus inquires as to how long the son had been in this wretched condition. And Mark tells us, "And he asked his father," this is Jesus asking the father, "How long is it ago since this came unto him?" And he said, "Of a child." Of a child is an unusual expression, but it simply means since childhood. His son had been like this since he was a child. Now, we're not given any idea here as to how old his son was. But the suggestion is, isn't it, that his son had been in this condition, he'd been afflicted like this for quite a long time. And then we see Jesus' response. And like I said, it sounds odd if you've only got the Matthew account. But when we know that the scribes are there, it's not so odd. Jesus says, "O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him hither," that is, bring him here, "to me." Now that statement must have been directed at those scribes, because although the disciples were often weak in faith, they were not totally faithless. And of course the father of this man is also exercising faith by seeking out Jesus. So he must be directing that comment at the scribes, who we know spent a lot of their time opposing him. Well, here Jesus appears to be quoting Deuteronomy 32 and verse 5, from the 5th of the 5 books of Moses. And that verse says, "They have corrupted themselves. Their spot is not the spot of his children. They are a perverse and crooked generation." That's part of what has now become known as the Song of Moses. And of course these scribes, they thought of themselves as experts in the books of Moses. But actually they were only bringing on themselves the kind of judgment that Moses declared against people like them. Having spent so much time with these kind of people, encouraging them to search the scriptures to see that they spoke of him, having done that, only for them to grow harder and harder in their sin, he now begins to tell them that their time is running out. And we shall see that culminate later in Matthew 23, where in verses 37 and 38, Jesus says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and ye would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate." So that's where their unbelief and their hardness of heart is leading to. Well, here, at the bottom of this mountain, then Jesus casts out the demon. As it says, the child was cured from that very hour. And I'll just point out, by the way, to anyone that's thinking, that word child, it doesn't give any indication of age. It's just a word that's used to refer to someone being a child of their parents, no matter what their age is. Just as I remain a child of my parents despite my advancing years. It's that kind of word that's used here. So we don't know that this was a little boy, just that he was this man's son. Well, understandably then, the disciples want to know why they couldn't do that. Let's not forget that they had cast out demons before. Jesus had previously sent them out to do just that, among other things, of course. He had sent 70 of his disciples out, and when they returned to him, in Luke 10 and verse 17, we're told, "And the 70 returned again with joy, saying, Lord, even the devils are subject unto us through thy name." So what had gone wrong? Why all of a sudden could they no longer do this? And Jesus tells them that it's down to their lack of faith. Now, I know our translation says unbelief, but they weren't unbelievers in the usual sense of the word, as we've already noted. Their faith, at least until after his resurrection, tended to burn hot and cool. The likelihood here is that they were, depending on past successes. Faith, as we know, must be continually expressed. It's not a one-off event. It's a way of life. The Apostle Paul would later write, "And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of the Son of God." Or he also says in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7, "For we walk by faith, not by sight." So Jesus then, he tells these disciples that they cannot cast out this demon because of your unbelief. "For verily I say unto you, if ye have faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye shall say unto this mountain, Remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you." Now you might know that a mustard seed is really, really tiny. It's really small. And on a previous occasion, Jesus has pointed out that it grows into quite a substantial bush. So its smallness is not a hindrance to its eventual size. And so Jesus tells his disciples here that while their thoughts are on themselves, they will be without ability. But if their faith is in him, there's no limit to what they can achieve. I mean, that is one of the key thoughts about faith, isn't it? It looks away from self and, importantly, of course, looks to Jesus. And, of course, I can't urge you strongly enough to always look to Jesus Christ. Now, Jesus often uses quite dramatic language to emphasize a point, as he does here. And he's not telling us that we could literally move a mountain from one spot to another. Despite the claims of many people on many televangelists, you never see anyone move a mountain from one place to another. What he's doing, he's telling us where our thoughts should be focused. If we are walking closely with God, we will not consider anything impossible to ask of him. And Jesus had actually told the father of the possessed child, or the possessed young man, this very same thing. And the father had given a very insightful response. Again, this is Mark 9:23. But Jesus said to him, "If thou canst believe, all things are possible to him that believeth." So that's basically the same thing that he said to his disciples. But the man, the father, responded, and straightway the father of the child cried out and said with tears, "Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief." The two statements, "I believe" and "help my unbelief," they may appear contradictory, but isn't this the very thing that we find in our own lives? As our faith is never perfect, which it isn't, we'd be foolish to claim that it was. As our faith is never perfect, well, it follows then, doesn't it, that we are partly unbelievers. But God forgives us, and he exercises such forbearance toward us that he reckons us believers on account of our small portion of faith. However, it is our duty to carefully shake off the remains of unbelief, which does stick to us like glue. We are to strive against it and to pray to God to correct our failings. We can also let this Father's tears also instruct us. We can look to his example in this. Because although I've said that we do lack faith, our lack of faith is a failing. It's not something we should be looking to be like, just because we are like it. It is a failing, even though it is common to us all. It should still trouble us that we cannot wholeheartedly rest in Christ, that we find our faith lacking, often at times when we should exercise it the most. But returning to the disciples, Jesus not only tells them that they could not cast out the demon because of their lack of faith, he tells them, "Howbeit, this kind goeth not out but by prayer and fasting." Now, before we answer the question, what kind of demon was this? This kind, we must note that the joining of fasting and prayer, very important. We should acknowledge, well, we do acknowledge, in fact, don't we, that we should often be in prayer. We might even say that our lives should be bathed in prayer. We probably say that a lot to ourselves, even when we're not doing it. We tell ourselves that we really ought to be more often in prayer. We ought to live a prayerful life. But we don't fast with that same kind of regularity. And well, we don't. In fact, we fast when there is some kind of urgency needed in prayer. So keep that in mind. That's when we usually fast, when there's an urgency in our prayer. So the only thing then, as we ask the question, what kind of demon was this, where Jesus says this kind only goes out by prayer and fasting, well, the only thing that we are told about this demon that marks it out is that he had been in possession of this son for a long time, since childhood, remember? So we can reasonably assume that he'd been able to sink deep roots into this person. Now I'm going to quote, I'm going to sort of quote John Calvin here, because he really does appear to have hit the nail on the head about this, but I am even paraphrasing him. But he says along the lines of, "So for the weakness of faith, Jesus prescribes prayer as a remedy." Well, we all agree with that. We say, yes, we should be praying for more faith. But then he adds fasting by way of a support. Because we have to remember that we do have a strong and powerful adversary to deal with. And he tells us we cannot play act with such a one. Satan will not yield until the battle has been fought out. Now, he'll lose, but he will fight the battle. So our faith must be therefore excited by prayer. That's what we say, we agree with that. But as we tend to be slow and lethargic in prayer, then we must resort to fasting as an assistance. Now, that does seem to capture the essence of what Jesus is saying to his disciples. You have to be that fervent in prayer. Now, of course, because Jesus himself is full of compassion, he did cure the son then and there. So he's shown us that he's Lord over the unseen realm in this way, that even the demons, no matter how well entrenched they may be, even they yield immediately to him. But I guess we're probably asking, but what can we learn from that? That might be an interesting account, but what can we learn from all this? And after all, we're not exactly surrounded by demon-possessed people. And we might ask, well, why is that? And I think I've told you this before, but it is worth hearing it again, that one of the things that Christ's death achieved was the binding of Satan. In Revelation 20, verses 2 and 3, there we read, and he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years, and cast him into the bottomless pit, and shut him up, and set a seal upon him, that he should deceive the nations no more, till the 1,000 years should be fulfilled. Now, as we read that book of the Bible, we discover that the 1,000 years is a representation of the gospel age, the time between the first and second coming of Christ. Elsewhere, in Colossians 2, verse 15, we read, and having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it being the cross, by the way. So the world, including the unseen world, has changed as a result of Jesus' death. And that is why we do not habitually come across demon-possessed individuals. So what can we learn then from this passage? Well, although Satan is bound, he's not without strength altogether. The Bible warns us about that. We have to keep in mind that we are engaged in a spiritual warfare. As it says in Ephesians 6:12, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. The point is that the battle may have changed, but it is no less real, and it is no less spiritual. So prayer is still the natural outworking of faith. And when the battle is exceptionally hot, fasting is still needful to be added to prayer. And I reiterate that our faith must be a lively faith. We must not be looking at a past event and then somehow trusting in that event. We must have our faith in something that happened to us some time ago. No matter how amazing that event was, our faith is to be a living, a daily faith. There is actually a philosophy, there's actually a view of life that encourages that kind of thinking, that, when all of life seems meaningless and despair takes hold, some religious experience from the past can be clung to and inject meaning into our lives. Sadly, I can't remember whose philosophy that is, so it's probably not much help to you. But biblical Christianity does not encourage us to cling on desperately to some past incident or happening in our lives. We are encouraged to walk daily with Jesus. Today, we are encouraged to experience, through faith, our family relationship with him. Tomorrow, we will be encouraged to do likewise, and the day after that. And then we have another example of how Jesus is Lord over the unseen realm. Almost immediately after Peter's confession that Jesus is the Christ, we read back in Matthew 16, the last chapter, and verse 21, from that time forth, began Jesus to show unto his disciples how that he must go unto Jerusalem and suffer many things of the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and be raised again the third day. Well, after curing this person from his demon possession, while they're still there in Galilee, Jesus again tells his disciples that this is going to happen to him. The only response we read about from his disciples on this occasion was that they were exceeding sorry. Mark tells us that they understood not that saying and were afraid to ask him. Why they should be afraid to ask is beyond me, but clearly that's how they were. Perhaps they felt that if they would voice their doubts, they would somehow be thought of as unspiritual. That's like people not raising questions at work, in case people think, well, why don't they know that? Well, maybe that's how they were. But patently, whatever the case, the message was not sinking in. Having shown his power over the unseen world, Jesus evidently sees this as an opportunity to declare his even greater power over the unseen. I mean, after all, what could be greater than being killed and yet for death being unable to keep hold of its prey? But Jesus, he begins by stating how he is going to be in a position whereby he will be killed. It will begin with him being betrayed. And as we know, that betrayal went from bad to worse. Judas, one of the 12, would betray him to the religious leaders, and they will betray him into the hands of the secular authorities, the Romans. They will not be satisfied until he has been killed. But his death, being the fulfillment of God's plan to redeem a people from their sin, and as Jesus is both man and God, death will be to him nothing more than a bug is to us. He will overcome death and rise again on the third day. Now, as these disciples didn't accept the plain message of what Jesus was saying to them, well, they didn't receive any comfort from it. They were left only with this sorrowful feeling. And we do well to remember that when we read our Bibles. Because first and foremost, we must take the plain meaning of a passage. Now, there will be occasions when we must use good and necessary deduction to understand a passage, but the vast majority of the Bible is readily and easily understood. If we ever start unnecessarily adding layer upon layer of man's wisdom on top, well, we will end up in something like the same position that these disciples were in. We'll find no comfort, no strength in a word that has been warped and twisted by our own ideas. Because you see, the biggest problem when we come to the scriptures, the biggest problem for us is we have a tendency to come to it with preconceptions. Because those disciples had in their mind what they thought the Messiah ought to be like, well, their minds were pretty much closed to the redemptive work that the Messiah was to undertake. And we can make similar mistakes when we read into Scripture what we think should be there, rather than allowing it to speak to us as those Scriptures actually are. And I would just say then that if you would spend eternity with Jesus, well, he must redeem you. I'm sure you know you cannot buy your way into heaven. But our Lord, the Lord of the seen and unseen realms, does redeem the lost. That's what he does. And because he alone has shown this power, you should seek him out. Just like that crowd at the bottom of the mountain, as soon as they saw him, they ran to him. That's what you should do. Because there's nothing to be gained by trusting yourself. You can only lose out by doing so. However, Jesus, he calls us across the years and across our preconceptions. He calls us that we may not be sorrowful, but that we may have life everlasting. And this is the Jesus that walked the streets of Galilee all those years ago. This is the Jesus who determined to go to Jerusalem that he might suffer that horrendous death at the hands of men for the purpose of saving his people. Today, you can go free from the power of evil, but only Jesus can grant you that freedom. So seek him now. Seek him while you can.